So, welcome to the High Middle Ages. I see we have a number of new people. This is a standalone series, even though in one sense it's a follow-up to the series that we did in the term just ending that was called the Early Middle Ages, and that went essentially from the year 600 to the year 1100. And here we are beginning at 1100, and we'll have a soft ending because the Middle Ages sort of peters into several other historical periods. But it'll be 1400, 1450, depending on topics that we include in the last session. The first session, the one we're going to be doing today, I've called the West Rebounds, and we're going to look at a lot of the social, economic, and cultural background to the period. We left last time talking about how finally Western Europe in the 11th century got to a point where it could stand next to the Muslim world and the Byzantine world as an equal, a cultural and really economic force finally, and could compete on the world stage. And we're going to look at more of the internals of what makes that the case. And in the second session, which I called God Wills It, Deus Vult, which was the papal cry to initiate the First Crusade, is going to look at a church turning extremely militant and the Crusades that are an outgrowth of that militancy, among several other things that are an outgrowth of that militancy. And session 3 is essentially going to look at the so-called 12th century Renaissance, the development of universities, the revival of classics due to the translation movement that takes Greek classics and translates them in Spain from Arabic into Latin, and we'll focus on that, and the invention in Paris of Gothic architecture, with Abbot Suger's great contribution in this regard. And session 4, I've called it Intellectual Expansion. It's going to look at 13th century philosophy, people like Thomas Aquinas. It's going to look at the developments of new forms of literature, popular literature, the chanson de geste and chivalric literature, Dante, this sort of thing, vernacular expressions, and really the first great forward movements in visual art outside of architecture, but we'll be looking at both art and architecture as it develops in this great age of the expanded view. In session 5, as a counterpoint, I called it Intellectual Contraction, because it's going to look at the outbursts of religious fervor, heretical expressions that develop as we look at groups that will anticipate the coming Protestant Reformation that'll follow in a couple of centuries, and the Roman Church's militant repression and attempts at repression of any forms of heretical thinking. And of course, as the church, and this is something that'll become a major theme in the class, as the church turns militant, Islam to the south, particularly in Spain, turns fundamentalist and militant. And you have a movement from a world that is fairly porous, open, and fluid, the Latin West and the Arabic Al-Andalus in Spain, turning into one of reconquista and hardened borders and repressive mindsets in the 13th and into the 14th century. And then we're going to have the final session, which I called the waning of the Middle Ages after the great book title of Johann Heisinger in 1920, wrote a great history book in which he talked about the lights of the Middle Ages growing dark. And it's basically, we're going to be looking at the impact that the plague had in the middle of the 14th century and the aftermath, what grows out socially and culturally from this great epidemic that dwarfs anything that we're looking at now. Actually, since it seemed to have killed off about a third of the European population, and in some hotspots in Saxony, 40% of the population. Anyhow, with that said, let's jump into session one. I want to remind everybody who's here that these lectures will get posted on the Miele channel on YouTube, usually a couple days after the lecture itself, and that I will be sending the slide presentation cumulatively as we go through as PowerPoints to everybody, usually within a day or so of the last lecture. So we begin our first slide. Europe in 1100. Basically, we had been addressing a Europe in the last course that had been fragile and isolated and very, very localized and inner-directed ever since the fall of the Roman Empire. The kind of fragmentation of centralized political authority that took place in the West meant that the only military or political authority that you had usually was something that was extremely local. And this was even the case when Charlemagne built the so-called Carolingian Empire, which really couldn't defend itself from Viking raiders and Saracen raiders coming from North Africa. I mentioned here that by 1050, Viking and Saracen raids were easily defended. Enough of a civic infrastructure had developed, both military, trade, and political infrastructure had begun to develop by the middle of the 11th century, that these places could protect themselves. Larger political units could begin to form. Urbanization could really begin to develop. And the reason I draw the circle on the western side of the Mediterranean here is to emphasize that Europe was once again in contact with the wider world. There was a return to the Mediterranean. You had major trading agents in Venice and Genoa and other Italian cities that were using port allies to connect to trade zones in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, Byzantium, and some of the Arab trade routes coming through Palestine and the like. But here we see the map. I'm not going to talk about the various other elements in the map, the separate units, because in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about regional developments in a more focused way. But basically, the big picture is you have the Latin West, which by the year 1100 includes Sicily, which has been come under Norman domination, that dark green down there. In southern Italy, the German so-called Holy Roman Empire, much fragmented, but a Christian Latin-based empire. The Kingdom of France, which was, as we will see, was really several places, even though you could call it the Frankish Kingdom. England, which by 1100, after William the Conqueror, had become a feudal state held by the Normans. And in Spain, as we'll see, there's still the dominant caliphate of Cordoba in the south, but the Christian substates in the north of Spain have managed to make incursions into Muslim-held territory, and it's the early stages of the Reconquista that we're seeing the effects of in this map. So moving into our closer focused view, if we first look at England, the map on the left, the upper left, in green you see Norman territory, and it includes, obviously, Normandy in France, which is where William and his minions had come from. And Brittany was a Norman dependency. I would add that what makes England a unique occurrence in this period is that the conquest of William and the Normans in 1066, and their capturing of an entire state, and you remember, those of you who sat through the last lecture, that I had stressed this, that England was one big feudal kingdom, meaning that everybody who held any level of local power in England had the king as his liege lord, meaning that the king really did have an ultimate claim on everything, every fief that was handed out to reward his followers. This is not the case anywhere on the continent, anywhere else on the continent. And because it's not the case, we will see, and I'll make a point of this more in the second lecture than now, but because of this, English law will maintain itself as common law inherited from the Anglo-Saxon Germans, while the continent, in Western Europe, most of whom were also from Saxon or other German derivation, are so fragmented that they can't build up a legal infrastructure one place to the next that you would call common. And therefore, as we will see, resort to, when it gets resurrected in the 11th and 12th centuries, will resort to the imperial Roman law that the intellectual revivals of Europe will resurrect. Justinian's law will be resurrected. And so the European continental traditions for law, whether it's in Italy or whether it's in France or whether it's in the lowland countries, tends to be not German common law, even though they had the same ethnic roots as the English did, but is really Roman law as filtered through a common law renaissance, an imperial law renaissance in the 11th century. So the middle map, so-called Angevin territory in 1152, by 1150, the Duchy of Normandy proper had passed to the Count of Anjou, who happened to be Henry II of England, and who then marries, by 1152, Eleanor of Aquitaine, the great Provençal former wife of the King of France, but they have had the marriage annulled because she wasn't able to give him any male heirs. And she ups and marries Henry, thereby creating, for a moment in history, a gigantic holding by the Angevin kings of England in Anglo-Norman, known as the Plantagenets, that really turns England into the major holder of property, of fiefs in France. So technically speaking, the Norman Duke is the vassal of the King of France, but he is actually more powerful than the King of France. So we're going to see very dicey political relationships taking place between England and France, which of course leads to about half a millennium of warfare between the English and the French afterward. I'm going to make in this and subsequent slides comments about language, and because lest you think that the French are running around speaking French or the English are running around speaking English, it's important to remember that the localist character of the earlier medieval period is still holds tremendous amount of cultural sway. There will be languages like Latin that'll be used by an educated class that is very small. But basically, it takes a while for people to build up adherence to some common dialects that begin to assert themselves as a major version of the local language, meaning a language that is spoken by everybody in addition to the private dialect that they might speak locally. Much in the way that any of you who are knowledgeable about the way dialects work in places like Italy, even into the 21st century, but certainly throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, people spoke local languages and then learned a super dialect, Tuscan, which becomes Italian because it's the first to develop a major literature thanks to Dante and thanks to the Florentine Renaissance. And so Italians in the early 20th century, very commonly, and all the way through the 20th century, would speak Venetian and Italian. They would speak Neapolitan and Italian. They would speak Marchigiano and Italian. And here in England, we see that there were local Old English dialects, Northumbrian, Mercian, Kentish, West Saxon. There were places where forms of Gaelic were spoken, and the northwest of England and Wales, and way down in Cornwall in the southwest. But the aristocracy in England for the next couple of centuries, beginning with William the Conqueror and all the way through Henry Plantagenet and his sons, Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland, would have spoken Anglo-Norman, a dialect of Middle French, if you will. And indeed, by the time we get to Chaucer, there's something which is, 1400 or so, there is a language barely recognizable as English. If you ever tried to read Canterbury Tales in Middle English when you were in college, but it has a tremendous amount of Anglo-Norman French influence in it, as well as Old Anglo-Saxon. And so doesn't become a modern language, certainly until the 15th to 16th century, really. If we move to France, the map on the left, so we have England, and in this green, the greater green blotch, we have the holdings of the French king, but you see that darker green within the lighter green. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? I didn't turn on my little annotation device, which I am going to do. If there's my little spotlight. Okay, so this darker green blotch is the royal domain of the King of France, who, if he left Paris, if he headed out into Champagne country or Troyes or wherever, could be taking his life into his own hands. I mean, he had vassals that were themselves robber barons. But his claim on the fealty of his vassals was restricted where they owed him, if you will, money or soldiers for wars. His claim is really in this green blotch. We have the Duchy of Normandy, and you see this little color coordinated legend at the bottom. So by the time we get to the 12th century, everything that is in this orangey to red spectrum is controlled by the Norman Duke or the King of England, if you will. And you see how the French king is really not in a position to assert a kind of national domination, or for that matter, linguistic domination at all. And if you went back to the year 1150 or 1180, one would have argued that there was probably more of a chance that the Norman dukes would consolidate power and that England and France would have become one place eventually. In the south, the county of Toulouse was outside of anybody's control for the most part, and was in the 12th century more under the influence of the German-speaking Holy Roman Empire to the east of them. So it's politically divided. The monarchy has a small domain and is liege lord only in the northeast, and that the English king controls Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. Now, linguistically, if you look at the map, I'll try to expand this a little bit so you get a closer look. If I can, okay, of this map. In this map, everything that is greenish to yellowish, you would arguably call an old version of French. Okay, the Breton were speaking a form of Gaelic over here. All of this would have been arguably a form of French. The reason this is color coded in this map, and why they're not all one color block, is to suggest the unity and disunity of the dialects. All these are separate dialects. The ones that are off yellow have more in common one with the other than the ones that are variants of the green. For instance, this was the region, though, this green region of the so-called Languedoc, which would have been this region. France generally was thought of by its residents, if you could call it France, by its residents as the territory where the word for yes was oui. That was the Languedoc. Down here in red, and what we would now call mainly Provence or Occitania, it was the Languedoc or Languedoc. It was the Languedoc, or the region where the word oc was used for the word yes in the south. And then in the blue over to the east here is the region, the Franco-Provençal, as it's called, mix. And in its extreme eastern counties, you probably have people using the long C, where C is the word for yes. And so it's not going to really be to the 13th century that Occitania begins to get absorbed into France, and we'll get to that politically later. So moving along, if we look at Iberia in our period, it's very politically divided. In this yellowish color is the Christian zone. In this bluish, purplish, whatever you call, lavenderish, whatever you would call that color, is Almoravid Muslim holdings, and Zaragoza over here. These are independent Muslim states. This does not do justice, this map, to the real political fragmentation that was going on in the Iberian Peninsula at this time. But in 1031, the Umayyad Dynasty, that was the dynasty that had been driven, if you remember last term, had been driven out of Damascus and come and establish an emirate in Cordoba, collapsed and was succeeded by so-called Taifa kingdoms. So these Taifa are faction kingdoms. So the Muslim corner of Spain and the borderlands were controlled by lots of petty princes, Muslim and Christian, for about 50 years. And so when we hear the folk tales the so-called Christian folk hero El Cid, he was actually a mercenary. And El Cid is a name taken from Arabic, where he was known as Al Sayyid, fought as a mercenary on both sides. Everybody tried to claim him. And there were lots of, if you will, treaties and backroom deals in which sometimes Muslim chieftains in some of the cities were making deals with Christians against fellow Muslims. So it was not even close to being a jihad in the sense of a religious holy war of any kind. What you really had is this no man's land, sort of in the middle of what we now think of as Spain. Now, the Berber Almoravid dynasty came to dominance in the late 11th century, and they were a much more conservative, fundamentalist group that will then get overwhelmed by a Berber Almohad dynasty from Morocco, who are even more fundamentalist and conservative, which will have tremendous cultural implications in the 12th century. I want to point out in this map, though, that at this point, late 11th century, Toledo is in Christian hands because it's going to have tremendous cultural significance. And by the way, when I say, as the border changes over time through the 11th and 12th centuries, that doesn't mean to suddenly say that a region that had recently been Muslim is now Christian, that in no way changes the population. It just changes the political control of the population. So you would have had a significant Christian population ever since the Visigoths had controlled this part of Spain, all for the centuries that was Muslim control. And the law of the dhimmis, by which the Muslims tolerated people of other peoples of the book, Jews and Christians, as long as they paid a tax specifically on them. There were significant Christian and Jewish populations in these places. With the early Christian occupation of Toledo, for instance, was still very tolerant of now the Muslim citizenry, as well as the Christian and Jewish populations that were there. There wasn't, in the late 11th century, a huge shift in population. There was no, in the 11th century, there was no pressure to convert in one direction or the other. But we'll be way attuned to this as we move along. In the map in the upper right, which is an early 12th century map, the border has shifted a little bit. We see this is a linguistic map. So now Al-Andalus is here, and emerging dialects are within the heavy borders. This tries to suggest linguistic as well as political boundaries in this map. So you have Gallego-Portuguese in yellow, Galicia and Portugal. You have Asturo-Leonese. You have Castilian, Aragonese, Catalan, Basque up in the north, and Arabic and Mozarabic. Now, to make a point about the vernacular languages that were spoken in Iberia at the time, Iberian Romance languages and dialects descend from Vulgar Latin, much the same way that Provençal and French language roots are in a Vulgar Latin, much the same way that all the Italian dialects descend from a Vulgar Latin. Basque is an isolate up here. It seems to be, nobody really knows, it seems to be pre-Indo-European. It's always been in the same place. There's reason to believe that they were genetically, when people do DNA studies, that they were there from a long time ago. And what I called Mozarabic, which is also known as, you'll see it in textbooks, as Andalusi Romance. It's the language spoken by non-Arabs in Arab Iberia. Now, the thing that's misleading is that all these other Proto-Spanish dialects, Castilian, Aragonese, were also arguably, you would lump them all in a pot and say that they were all Andalusi Romance dialects. The distinction formally is that these are the versions spoken within Arab rule. This is to say that there would have been many Arabs, or Muslims, I should say, not so much Arabs as Muslims, in Al-Andalus, who also spoke some version of Romance language, a kind of Proto-Spanish. And again, this will have significance in terms of the later lectures, but I'll just leave it at that for now. The Holy Roman Empire, another case of hyper-political division. And you see in purple, the so-called Holy Roman Empire is controlling much of northern Italy, including Tuscany, including the Duchy of Spoleto. Even though these are not German-speaking regions, we'll get to the other map soon. And that in green, and the map on the left, is the Papal States. And we have the areas of Germany that were really very separate places. Saxony, Franconia, Bohemia, this is really modern Czechoslovakia, all the way to the border of Hungary. Much of this is now Italy, Switzerland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Western Poland, Alsace-Lorraine, here we are here, the Low Country, Friesland, Holland, etc. The emperor is historically, ever since the Carolingian Empire crumbled, is historically elected. The Grand Dukes of these significant places like Franconia and Saxony pick out someone from among their peers. There are 7 electors to be the next emperor. So whoever is the emperor isn't the liege lord, can't really control the other electors, all of whom stand as equal to him, okay? And the only method open to the Holy Roman Emperor to try to bind people who can contribute to his power, can bind them to him, is through the appointments or investitures of bishops and abbots, and exchange as currency for allegiance. So really, the only way he gets political control of any period is a bishop dies or an abbot dies, and there's an opportunity to appoint somebody and call in huge favors. I'll give this to you. Nobody can hold it as an inheritance. I can give this to whom I want to give it to, and now they owe me big time. And we'll see why this is significant when we get into the next lecture. Now, linguistically, if we look at the map on the right, all those areas in that, like lavender, all the way through the orangey and yellowish areas, are areas where some dialect of Old German is spoken. Now, the borders in red of the Holy Roman Empire include areas that are French-speaking, Slavic-speaking, Hungarian-speaking, even and Italian-speaking. So it's really a mishmash, the Holy Roman Empire. And we will see that one place to the next, there is no such thing as Hochdeutsch, as a unified German spoken. You'll get Old Saxon, Old Frisian, Old Bavarian, Old Alemannish in the various places. So all these subworlds that we're looking at in Europe are still heavily fragmented. Moving to Italy, so here is a map of Italy, and we have very distinct zones. There's the zone that belongs to the Holy Roman Empire, but what we see in that northern zone is the development, and this map highlights them, of communes, cities that, because this becomes the trade center of Europe, which again we'll look at in a moment, cities that form communes and write charters for themselves as early as the 11th century. And I'd say over here, by 1140, almost every episcopal city, every city that had a bishop, had formed a commune for protection and liberty. Basically, these trade zones were able to command enough local wealth as to buy privileges, liberties, if you will, from the local lord or warlord who would ostensibly try to control them politically. So they could trade moolah for independence to a degree, to a very significant degree. And because some of the trade families in these urban centers went into banking and really and shipping, and were really able to accumulate significant wealth, which could be used against and with the poorer old aristocracy that was still living in a manorial economy in the boondocks. So Northern Italy is going to spearhead this movement towards communes and the development of town culture and town society as a distinct feature of the High Middle Ages. In the middle, you've got what the map called the Patrimony of St. Peter, the Papal States. It was really heavily controlled by the Holy Roman Emperor, but the Pope was ostensibly the liege lord of that region. There in the south, you have Sicily by this point under the control of the Normans, the same Normans who went to England. They're actually not the same ones that went to England, but other Norman warlords had been invited by locals, including by local outliers of the Byzantine Empire, to help with political situations as the Arabs in Sicily and in southern Italy and the Byzantine elements in southern Italy were contending with one another. They invited Norman mercenaries. Remember, the Normans had been they were Vikings who settled into Normandy in the 10th century and developed French as their primary language, and still were handier with battle axes than most other groups in the West, and hired themselves out as mercenaries quite frequently. And the southern Italian Normans, Tancred and Roger the Norman, and we'll see Bohemond and his family when we get to the First Crusade. They come down, hire out as mercenaries, and then through much jockeying for position, establish the Kingdom of Sicily, which itself is a series of duchies, the duchies of Calabria, and we'll address this later on. So this linguistic map of Italy, I don't want to look at it too closely because you'll go nuts trying to make sense of the sub-regionalization of linguistic dialects in Italy in the medieval period. There are areas in Italy that are speaking versions of Old Croatian. There are places that are speaking Greek, Grecia Salentina. There are places that are speaking Slavic-influenced Latin. There are places that are speaking, you see up in the north, that are speaking Ladino, which is up in the Tyrol, which is the closest Latin-based dialect of all the Romance languages. It's the closest one to classical Latin of any of the Romance languages. And it's still spoken in some of the valleys up there. There's Venetian, which is its own language. There's Slovenian spoken. There's Franco-Provençal spoken in what is part of the Holy Roman Empire, but is really going to become part of Italy. And of course, these dialects, as I mentioned down here, they remain separate languages right into the modern period, right into the 20th century. There's still people who speak local Greek and Albanian dialects in southern Italy and Sicily. Anyhow, it's a period of huge population growth. And what happens after the year 1000 AD, or Common Era, is that the velocity of growth accelerates and increases. So this map, I couldn't find a good map for 1100 that showed urban settlement, but I found this one follows all the way up to 1300, and the little circles are dominated, the size of them are dominated by the size of population. You'll see that almost nothing makes it. If you see Venice here and Paris and London are the only ones who make it over 100,000, even by the year 1300. But you see the concentration of them in coastal areas and heavy trade areas, northern Italy, and of course this corridor for trade that is southeastern England and northwestern, the Low Countries and France. And why does population increase? Well, agricultural production rises. Remember, you're still living in a world that is essentially a subsistence world where there isn't that much excess wealth over and above the production of what you need to feed the population, but it increases at a rate that actually does increase surplus wealth. And that's due to a combination of the development, the adoption, I should say, of the heavy plow that could really break tough marginal soil and dig up heavy tree roots. This is the plow. Have you ever seen pictures? This is the sort of plow that you would have need a double ox team to pull, sometimes 4 oxen. It was like dragging anvils through the soil. And the Romans had used the arare, which was the lighter wooden plow that allowed you to get in 6 inches to well turned over soil, but would never have helped in areas of Europe that had been heavily forested. And the expansion as a result of that, a heavy plow, of farmland into deforested regions and regions that had been drained. So the Netherlands was already developing its drainage irrigation system. And of course, the 3-field system, crop rotation and the development of the 3-field system, leaving one fallow, moving one to alfalfa, having one under crops at any given time, and then rotating that, those 3 fields. Political stability in this period. So Viking and Saracen raids are being controlled, and the building of what the English call boroughs, burgs, if you like. These were towns with defensive walls. They're both the earliest form of town and a fortress simultaneously. And these were built in all the most endangered areas to the point that they could get defenses to their local area around them very quickly, and therefore dissuaded Viking raiders from the opportunity of making what had always been easy pickings in the 9th century, the 8th and 9th centuries. And trade and commerce increased significantly as the excess population from rural regions moves to towns. So in this chart at the bottom, I put a number of European and world cities. These are way approximate, these numbers that I found through some sources on the internet, and sometimes you can't even find them. But you'll see that Constantinople, which was maybe like in 1100, Constantinople was anything from 200,000 to 400,000. I just arbitrarily suggested that it was about 250,000 in this period. And by towards the very end of the Byzantine Empire's significance, you'll see there's a tremendous decline in population. Of course, 1350 is dicey because it's a year that basically is coterminous with the Black Death. So it depends whether the demographers were doing the estimate before or after the plague hit their area. So this might be a post-plague number. But we'll see in the trading centers like Venice, there'll be this tendency, a slow and steady increase, so that by 1300, Venice is on the map as a major trade player, as is Genoa on the map by the time we get to 1300. And places like Ghent, trading centers in Belgium. London is on the map. Paris is very significantly on the map for many reasons, and gets on the map as early as 1200, as we see, and just continues to grow. Of course, takes a hit for the Black Death. Marrakesh in Morocco. We see Milan as a player in the period. Rome, of course, despite its preeminence as the center of the church, is fairly small and stable all through the period because it never becomes a significant economic or trade center. So if we look at European trade on this map, the brown lines are showing you major trade routes. So you see there is one major overland connection between the northern communes of Italy with their importation centers of Venice and Genoa and Pisa, and banking centers like Florence, and Siena, and how they move overland to the so-called fairs of Belgium, northern France. And these big trade fairs were places where the Hanseatic towns, which is basically a ring of coastal trade cities that span from what we would call Russia all the way through the German states, would bring, everything from textiles and leather and furs to trade for other stuff. And the trade from the Far East, and Byzantium and Muslim countries who would come up through Italy could be exchanged either in Italy or at the trade fairs. And this is also the connection between what would become the major wool trade that would develop in England, where raw material would then be sent for weaving into the Low Countries and for high finishing in northern Italy, but at the end of the line. So we can have all those sheep becoming wool, becoming Giorgio Armani by the time we get down here. And of course, these trade routes then become as well cultural exchange routes. The question is, how did they travel around the Alps? They didn't. They went through the valleys. They basically took the grand passes. So whether, depending where you were, in Venice, going straight north, there is a pass that goes to the Alps that you can still take going up from Bassano del Grappa, the Brenner, the so-called Brenner Pass. There were passes into France from what is now the Piedmont, northwestern Italy. And it did take a month to make these journeys from Genoa, let's say, to the Champagne Fair, which is one of the big centers. Anyhow, so we have trading posts. And of course, there was huge amounts of exchange. These are the paths, by the way. It's not by accident that when we see realistic portraiture enter Italian art from the region down here, that extensively and coincidentally, we find it also developing in places like Bruges and Ghent simultaneously, that you get two great traditions of representational art taking place in the two big trade centers that are constantly looking at each other and learning to speak each other's cultural language as well as trade language. Anyhow, the growth of towns. Ein fester Burg ist unser Gott. A mighty fortress is our God. For defense, boroughs, were walled or fortified settlements originally under the protection and jurisdiction of local nobles. But as I pointed out last slide, they managed to buy some room for liberty in the face of that. So the important residents of these towns, the important people, the better class, if you will, these are the people who come to be known in the various European languages as burghers or burghers, as burgesses, as the borghesi, as the bourgeoisie, as the bourgeoises. And I have on the right here, and I can expand our view of these. So here's Monteregione, In Italy, here is that marvelous, I've never been to Carcassonne. This looks like it's worth a visit when we get past COVID. And of course, San Gimignano, which many of you may have been to. And you understand the interest in heavy defense. In fact, the towers of San Gimignano were built by families who were looking to be defended from other Italian families. We'll talk about that when we get there. So commerce, the towns were market centers for the local populace, and in the case of fairs, for regional and foreign trade as well. So all sorts of things were hitting the road. Sea travel and river travel was still your best bet if you could bring it off. Excess rural peasantry streamed into towns to work in the expanding trades. So, whoops, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. Can we all mute ourselves? There's somebody who, thank you. Let me for a second, where, I will be with you in 1 sec. I'm just going to make sure everybody is on mute again. Okay, there we go. So, we were speaking of communes and free cities earlier. In the 11th century, town elites began to bond, take oaths for mutual defense and common interests. Over time, collective bargaining with the aristocracy or monarchy results in charters that granted towns freedom in exchange for taxes or duties. Somebody was pointing out to me that Carcassonne is a little touristy these days. I'm sure all these places are pretty touristy these days. The communes were very tightly knit organizations. They are self-governing corporations controlled by the local bourgeoisie, which we'll address going forward. But the famous phrase that characterizes town life in this period is that the Stadtluft macht frei nach Jahr und Tag. City air makes free after a year and a day. And the legal tradition that develops is that liberated serfs or absconding serfs were legally free with no claim on their servitude or their indenture, were legally free after a year and a day as a resident of a city, which meant that heading to town was heavily incentivized. You wanted to get to a town if you could. The culture of these towns, of course, is far different from what we would have faced a century or two earlier. The expansion of social classes was significant. So remember we spent a lot of time in the last course talking about the social order of the feudal world consisting of those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, as they called it, churchmen, the aristocracy, and the rural serfs. Town life adds merchants, artisans, urban proletarians. These people, and this has become in the 11th century, as early as the mid-11th century, a legal problem, and why they really have to develop law systems quickly, because these people exist outside the manorial economy and with very few established guideposts. What exactly is the status of somebody who had been a serf and is now apprenticing out as a blacksmith in some town? And what does the law say about the status of such people? We will say work is organized largely in guilds which are corporations. The medieval world was extremely corporate. Towns might be free, but internally they were quite rigid and hierarchical. So the craft guilds, they set prices, they protected members from competition. In some cases, they hold progress down by preventing competition. They controlled professional standards. They monitored the training of artisans and prevented too many competitors from entering the field. And of course, the training is the traditional apprentice to journeyman to master training. And the top picture on the right, a little market from a slightly later medieval period. This is probably late 13th century, early 14th. This probably 12th century depiction of construction, probably on some early Gothic cathedral. As the European economy matured, the range of trades multiplied. So by 1350, Paris had over 350 guilds. Now, what I can't emphasize enough is that the bourgeois ethos of these towns was something new. Merchants and artisans, this is a professional class. This is a group of people not defined by privilege or subjugated by law. These were people who were defined by what they did, and they had to live by their wits and their devotion to work, by their work ethic, if you will. Their success or failure depended in very large measure on a code of personal responsibility and their membership in the little republics of town and guild. And so when we think of in later periods, the bourgeoisie as becoming the very central defining group for what will emerge as the Protestant ethic, this is where it has its roots, right here. They knew they were different. They knew they were a new fourth wheel in the social enterprise. And so they tended, in the value system that develops, to have little tolerance either for what they regarded as undisciplined and belligerent nobles, the illiterate robber barons who would still try to knock somebody over the head and steal their wallets along the trade routes, were not something that they respected, and they were trying to protect themselves and gain independence from that group. And they had very little respect for the parish priests and churchmen who they regarded as lazy, ignorant, undereducated, and not subject to the same professional standards that they themselves had. And as a result of this, a phenomenon develops in the same period that towns develop, largely in the same places that towns develop. There is a resurgence of religion, but it is a new form of piety. I'll call it through these lectures the new piety. It is the emergence of personal religion, at the center of which is the image of Jesus, not in glory. Not, remember the slides I showed in the last semester to make this distinction from the other side? If you look at the Byzantine domes, you will see Christ as the king in glory, as the Pantocrator, the creator of the universe. This is a shift to Christ, not as the God of power and glory, but as the human who suffered and died. The human who a civic member of a town who prides himself on his own moral and professional status in his community can identify with. This is a Christ who can provide lessons and a sense of mission to himself as a citizen of the Christian universe. This is a model for what the priest should be. This is a model for what the church should be. It's new, it's emotionally charged, and it focuses on the infancy of Christ. The baby Jesus is suddenly everywhere, but even more so, the passion of Christ as he suffers for the sins of us all, and the death. And of course, on the sorrows of Mary, his mother, the Blessed Virgin. And so we get representations of Christ in this period everywhere as the man of sorrows, ecce homo. Here is, behold mankind. And as this happens, simultaneous with this development, we are going to see representational images of Christ begin to emerge, because now he is personally connected to, so he must look like us. And so I chose in the subpicture, I chose, obviously something that comes from the 15th century, just because the Flemish did it up so well, and we have the wounds and the like. But in an earlier version, Cimabue, in one of his crucifixes in San Domenico in Arezzo, and it's this image of Christ, the man who is suffering. And I have a quote up here from a famous medieval historian, Richard Southern, in The Making of the Middle Ages, famous book of his. He describes this spiritual yearning in the 11th century as and I quote him here, an urge towards a greater measure of solitude, of introspection and self-knowledge. It ran like fire through Europe and the generation after St. Anselm's death, and produced an outburst of meditations and spiritual soliloquies. And here I have an excerpt from a slightly later meditation, Richard Rolle in English, on the Passion of Christ. Ah, Lord, your sorrow, why was it not my death? Now they lead you forth as naked and as a worm, with torturers around you and armed knights. The press of the crowd was incredibly intense as they threw things and harried you so shamefully, kicking at you as if you had been a dog. I see in my soul how ruefully you walk, your body so bloody, so raw and blistered. The crown on your head is so sharp, and your hair, blown in the wind, is all matted with blood. Your lovely face is so pale and swollen with the blows and the beatings, and covered with spittle and phlegm, and down runs your blood. It horrifies me to see it. So, as I point out in the box at the bottom, a religion of religious struggle and passion was the perfect fit for these new urban professionals, with their sense of personal responsibility and their sense of holding the vehicle of their own destiny in their hands. And of course, the great entertainments of this period included passion plays and street preachers, and the great processions that you see in films of the Middle Ages, the great processions of flagellants and people marching on pilgrimages, and penitential pilgrimages to Compostela and wherever. So The cult of Mary also develops as part of this new piety. And Mary is now the sad Mary. She is not the Mary of Byzantine iconography. She is the Mater Dolorosa. She's the sorrowing Mary, the second, and she's a person, the second person to receive devotional attention as a sympathetic figure who becomes strikingly sorrowful. And the hymn, the 13th century hymn, Stabat Mater Dolorosa, Juxta Crucem Lacrimosa, Dum Pentebat Filius. Any of you who were raised in the Catholic Church remember singing the Stabat Mater in Latin as part of Lent. At the cross her station keeping, stood the mournful mother weeping, etc. And I want to point out that the feminine and feminist elements ascribed to Mary are significant in this new personal religion because women will have strongly and powerfully emergent roles. And it's a kind of a counterpoint to the chivalric depiction of women, which was also a very enhanced view of women that we'll be talking about in 12th century poetry. So we're here, I have various pietas, the Retkin pieta of the 14th century and the Roger van der Weyden of the 15th century and another Balzigen in the 15th century, and of course the famous Michelangelo, the serene Mary, the agonizing, sorrowful mother. It's always much more of a northern vision. There was a tremendous amount of anti-clericalism that develops in this period. Social attitudes about the church and clergy took a huge critical turn. The secular clergy were seen as lax. By the way, this image on the right here, we have an abbot taking money for something or other. The fact that most priests were married with families and lived on local tithes did not reflect well with the new urban classes. They were seen as leeches. Monasteries and convents were often rich landlords. Their elaborate liturgies were not seen as particularly conducive to sanctity. Moreover, the social utility of the scriptoria, where they copied manuscripts, and the monastic schools were quickly being displaced by new urban schools, the new cathedral schools, as we will see, that will develop into universities. Bishop seats were pawns in the feudal game of handing rich fiefs to loyal vassals and were subject to accusations of simony, selling church offices for money. And a particular sub-aspect of anti-clericalism is what I will call here anti-sacerdotalism, against priests as their function, in their function as priests. It's a kind of proto-Protestantism. The religious mood of the period so focused on spiritual purity that the efficacy of sacraments themselves, when bestowed by corrupt priests, was called into questions. Now, this was an old heresy from the 4th century that St. Augustine had to fight, the so-called Donatist heresy that will be raised continuously through our period, all the way to Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. And it really, several eminent churchmen who still are recognized as saints by the church trot along on the very fringe of this heresy, by which they say that the sacrament of an unworthy priest carries no efficacy, no grace in the act itself. They're looking for this new piety wants purity. It wants authenticity. Laymen, particularly the urban business people who saw the world as a simple affair of profit and loss, had little need for sacraments presented by patently inferior, inauthentic, or corrupt priests. So what we get is a major monastic reform movement in this period. and the first expression of which is an aggressive return to what the early monks called the desert, because monasteries in Egypt used to be founded out of cities in the desert. And I want to point out, it's something that I'll mention in a couple of places, but monastic revivals tend always to develop out of fairly successful urban environments. Being surrounded by urban wealth, when there is a pious turn of mind, tends to want to divest of that wealth and return to material sacrifice. And that's what happened here. So the criticism of the worldly monasteries of Cluny, remember the great Benedictine revival of the earlier century that we had spoken of in the last course, that was very vested in acquiring wealth and feudal endowments so that they could have their wonderful libraries and manuscript collections and the like. Criticism of those and the new mood of intense personal religion triggered an explosion of monastic reforms. In each new foundation, the goal was to strictly follow the monastic observances of the desert fathers of Egypt, or at least a more faithful version of Benedict's rule, the 6th century monastic rule of Saint Benedict. The new groups were often hermitic. They were hermits. And the first one I want to talk about is the Carthusians, instituted by Saint Bruno in the 11th century, who founded a hermitage near Grenoble and refused an appointment as Bishop of Reggio Calabria. And of course, the Grand Chartreuse is up here in the high mountain valleys. It's interesting, they always call it the desert, but they always build it in Europe and in remote mountain valleys. The so-called charter houses, or certosas, as the Italians would have it, the standard style is a little chapel for prayer and oratory surrounded by small individual cells. I could have given you a closer picture, but I wanted to create a sense of the majesty of the placement. If here you see all those little cells down there. So the monks all live. They're hermits who come together for communal chanting, but then go right back to their isolated existence. Monks live in total silence, observe a simple diet, and are occupied entirely by prayer, study, and work. I have a picture of a Carthusian refectory. This is St. Hugh. I love the paintings of the great Spanish painter Francisco de Zubarán. This is such a glorious painting. Too bad we can't spend more time with it. I'll try to incorporate some of his stuff as we move along. The legend depicted here, St. Hugh made a gift of meat. That's St. Hugh made a gift of meat to Bruno. I guess that's Bruno, the abbot over here, and his monks. And they all fall, according to the legend, into an ecstatic dream while discussing whether to break their Lenten fast by eating the meat. When Hugh arrives, it's now 45 days later, and the meat is still sitting there, but it had turned to ashes. And so as a consequence, the Carthusians, according to the legend, decide they're going to be vegetarian after this. They're never going to eat meat again. And this is an allegorical presentation of the legend. The Cistercians develop in the same period, and they're significant, the so-called white monks. In 1098, a group of Benedictine monks who felt that the abbeys of Cluny had abandoned the simplicity and rigor of the rule of St. Benedict. So under the leadership of Robert de Molem, they established, there's still a famous monastery called Molem. They accepted Saint Pierre de Solem. They established a monastery at Citeaux. Cistercium means reeds in Latin. It's in a French marsh. And they are the foundation house for this great order. They're Cenobites, meaning they live in groups. They're not hermits. And though they're very tolerant of strict ascetic practice, Citeaux is dedicated to the communal ethos of Benedict's rule. Ora et labora, pray and work. The second abbot, that's from the rule of Benedict. Alberic established a principle that an abbey had to be self-sufficient, which required manual labor and not dependent on aristocratic gifts. He adopted the use of white habits. Black was reserved for hermits. Stephen Harding, the third abbot, whose little picture is over here, preferred to accept gifts of uncleared land, which would give the monks things to do, and allow him to send monks for new houses, daughter houses, out into remote regions. This is the way much of Europe's farmland was reclaimed in the 12th century. And so he had to include lay brothers to help with the farm work. They write a charter. Citeaux spans hundreds of daughter houses over the next century. The guiding charter, which is written by Stephen Harding, and here he is presenting a picture of his church to the Virgin. But each house the charter established that each house could elect its own abbot, but was subject to a compulsory general chapter, which means that they could send groups of abbots to visit daughter houses to make sure that conformity and style and observance and liturgy was being observed. So in effect, Benedict had created totally independent abbeys. No Benedictine abbey is dependent on another. And Cluny was organized as a centralized grand order, and these guys were sort of in between. They develop a style of architecture that's called unadorned. So I have pictures of various Cistercian enterprises. They were permitted only limited ornamentation. You can always tell when you're in a Cistercian house by the lack of ornamentation. Benedictine houses would have had all sorts of frescoes and things of that order. So this is, since Napoleon did some abbey closing, these are now really French museums. Senanque in the lavender fields in Provence and Tournai, and they're gorgeous for the simplicity. Fossanova in Lazio is south of Rome on the west side of Italy. Tintern Abbey, the famous Tintern Abbey in Wales, and Santa Maria de Veruela in Aragon and northeastern Spain. So you get these gorgeous, we're going to be talking more about architecture coming soon, but these gorgeous renditions of the unadorned style. And in the last slide, the spread of the monastic reform movement. And the reason I make such a thing of the Cistercians is, as you see in the three maps at the bottom, each house was seeded from another house. So bands of 12 monks following the protocol in Benedict's rule, they would travel, they would be sent out to the next place that needed to have its farmland recovered, and they would build those little churches from scratch. Lay brothers and monks alike would get out there and farm and build, and so they only got into trouble when they became so proliferated that people started leaving the money later on, and they needed another reform movement, the so-called Trappists that we find from La Trappe in France, which was a reform movement within the Cistercians, but much later on. The ethos that supported land clearance and architectural construction required new locations on a regular basis. So the spread. Small, barely supportable monasteries were less liable to the corrupting influences of wealth and what I call here institutional bloat. Whenever critical mass was succeeded, it was time to retrench. The contagious religious piety of the age attracted recruits at a ferocious pace. Note, Benedictine and Carthusian houses were usually built on mountaintops, the desert. Cistercians, mindful of the need to support themselves through farming, built in the valleys. So here you have 1098, here you have 1150, and then by 1200, in 50 years, a handful of daughter houses had produced this gargantuan number of daughter houses. So it really had become a rage. And the Cistercians have, as was true of the culture of the new piety, a special devotion to Mary. And I'll mention this again later on, but every Trappist, for instance, every Cistercian of the new strict observance has as a first name Mary, and they're known by their second name. So there might be somebody known as Father Lewis, but he's actually Father Mary Lewis, or Father Mary John, or Father Mary Alfred, kind of thing. Anyhow, that is today. I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to remove the pin. And if anybody has either a question that they would like to ask out loud or chat, and feel free. We have a few more minutes. I know some people are going to scurry off because there is something at 3 o'clock that some people have signed up for. I think that's what we got scheduled earlier. As I said, I will send out the PDF of today's slides, and the entire lecture will be posted online on the YouTube channel.
This is a lot of information, so thank you for sending that out. I want to review it.
Okay, good. And of course, it's because it's the first one, and I have to set the context, and a lot of what we'll be talking about subsequently will return to several of the things, the salient things that I tried to highlight in this first one.
Lou, I've got a question about your wonderful chart, your population chart. I was looking through it, and you sort of, for most cities, you see what you expect, a big drop for showing what the effect of the plague. But the city that really baffled me was Milan. Could you take a look at that and look at the last 3 entries on that? Because it shows it making a horrendous drop in population even before the plague.
That could have been political.
The Black Death, rather.
Yeah, that could have, it's one of two things. It could have been, Milan was a hot potato in imperial politics. And it could have been a result of that and church empire contention. And it may have been that, and it simply may have been that the numbers that some demographer showed me from that period were just wonky.
Right, right. Well, it looks as if it was abandoned. The city was abandoned essentially in the year 1300.
No, I don't think.
I'm hoping it's the wonky. I hope the answer is just wonky numbers.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't abandoned. Here, let me find that guy again. I'm looking through myself. I actually think that's a typo. I actually think I meant that to be 120,000.
Oh, I'm so relieved. I'm so relieved. the thought of that wonderful city being, of tumbleweeds going through there in 1300 is really disturbing.
Thanks for pointing that out. All right, gang. What I will do.
Lou, one more question.
Oh, go ahead.
You didn't mention anything about the Muslim religion or Maimonides in the 12th, 13th century. Is that
I'm going to be mentioning a lot about Jewish intellectual culture and Islamic culture, intellectual culture, when we get to the 12th century Renaissance and following.
okay? I just, because it was just centered on the Christian, abbeys and whatnot. So,
Right, because what I'm setting up actually is an explanation for the church's response in the 11th century, which will drive both the external crusades in the Holy Land and the internal crusades against Islam, Jews, and the Albigensians of Provence. So that kind of militancy, which sort of controls the Roman Church after the 11th century, is explained by this pietism that arises in the 11th century. And one of the reasons I spent so much time with that.
okay.
Anything else? Well, there's other chats here. Okay. I'll see you gang next week.